Welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to be able to join you today. The University of London has arranged this special talk for ULIP students to mark the end of what has been a very odd year indeed. And it is a testament of your resilience that you've moved seamlessly from your normal academic life in Paris to a much more isolated and challenging world, and continued without interruption your studies and assessments. I'd like to thank you for your patience and strength in these trying times. L'ULIP retrace son histoire depuis plus d'un siècle et, à travers cette période, a joué un rôle important dans la relation franco-britannique, en aidant les étudiants et les universitaires à travailler ensemble sur un large éventail de disciplines académiques, mais toujours avec les dimensions transnationales et interculturelles et linguistiques. Ce travail est maintenant aussi important qu'il n'a jamais été et, espérons-le, contribuera à consolider et à renforcer les amitiés et les collaborations entre nos deux pays, quels que soient les défis auxquels nous sommes confrontés à l'avenir. Aujourd'hui, je suis très heureux de présenter l'ambassadeur britannique en France, Lord Llewellyn. Edward Llewellyn est devenu ambassadeur britannique en France le 9 novembre 2016. Il est un francophone avec plusieurs périodes de travail à Paris, ainsi que des postes de direction avec diverses responsabilités de Sarajevo à Hong Kong. Plus récemment, avant de rejoindre l'ambassade, il était chef de cabinet de Downing Street sous l'ancien Premier ministre David Cameron et son chef de cabinet en tant que chef de l'opposition. The ambassador has very kindly agreed to talk to us today about the Franco-British relationship as it moves through both Brexit and the current COVID crisis. I know that all of you living and studying in Paris are engaged in studies of history, politics, literature, law, urban society, and international relations. I also know that some of our students in the past have gone on to careers in the Foreign Office and have indeed worked in the British Embassy in Paris. And so it is a very special pleasure to hear from the senior British diplomat in France. And if I may, I'd like to commence this session by asking the ambassador what it is like at a human and professional level to be a diplomat working in these unprecedented times. Over to you, Ambassador.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Tim, for inviting me to this session today. Can everybody hear me and see me okay? Fantastic. The wonders of modern technology. Well, the answer to your question is, what's it like to be leading our embassy here at this moment, and indeed over the last 3.5 years? The answer to that I can sum up in a sentence. It's a huge privilege, a privilege every day to be doing that, leading an amazing team in an amazing country with an incredibly important relationship with the United Kingdom. And I feel that that privilege and sense of responsibility every day. But obviously, my tenure here has coincided with some quite dramatic developments, both recently, of course. We've all been coping with this unprecedented, really, period of a global pandemic, which has had a big effect on France, just as it has had on the United Kingdom. And as an embassy, I'm very proud of the way we adapted almost overnight to working in a completely different way. And you'll be very familiar with this at ULIP. The very fact that we're holding this meeting over Teams, we're holding it virtually, is just one example of that. But we moved as an embassy, and we're approaching 300 people as an embassy, as a mission here across France, with the bulk of our personnel here in Paris in both the embassy and the consulate across the road. We also have a consulate in Marseille and another consulate in Bordeaux, and a trade office in Lyon, and a network of honorary consuls around the country. And that whole network shifted pretty much overnight to working remotely from home. Fortunately, and not every foreign office in the world, I think, is in this position, but we were equipped several years ago with laptops that link up to the Foreign Office system in London and to our counterparts around the world. And those systems have really come into their own during this crisis, because they've allowed us to continue our work, to continue operating, continuing to serve the government, and above all, to serve British citizens here in France, as well as the relationship between our countries and between our governments. And I'll zoom out in a moment to talk about, if it would interest you, the relationship as a whole. But just to give you some examples of the sort of things we've been doing in an embassy, as an embassy, over the last, whatever it is now, 12 to 14 weeks. In the initial period, there was a lot of work to be done, like our counterpart embassies around the world, looking after British citizens, those who wanted to return home, who were visiting France at the time, but who needed to get home, looking after British citizens who live here in France. And there are, we don't have a precise number, but the official figure is around 150,000, but it could be as many as twice that number, who make their lives here in France, and who look to us as an embassy to help them in times of difficulty, and also to provide information. We had issues involving, for example, cruise ships with British citizens on board, docking in Marseille, and the Brits on board needing to be repatriated, returned home, and then working together with our French counterparts to bring home our citizens from all over the world. And France, like Britain, has a public who love traveling and who work and travel overseas. And we had, I think in the case of Britain, over 1 million of our citizens overseas when this crisis struck, who wanted to return home. Many of them did so by commercial means, but quite a number from the more far-flung parts of the world needed to be brought home using flights specially arranged by the British government, or indeed by the French government. And we took several hundred of each other's citizens home from different parts of the world. A good example of Franco-British cooperation in action. More recently, we've worked together on what in France we call deconfinement, what in the UK is referred to as easing the lockdown. And we're trying to share best practice, trying to share our respective experiences, recognizing that each country is experiencing this epidemic in a slightly different way, slightly different way. But it's important as neighbours and partners and allies and friends that we learn from each other. So that's what we're doing now. Our consular services, for example, helping Brits across the country, have remained open and operating throughout the pandemic. Obviously they've been doing a lot less face-to-face contact, but in the case of issuing emergency passports, they've maintained that service throughout. Just stepping back from this immediate crisis, obviously the relationship between Britain and France is as important today probably as it's ever been. We're two similar-sized countries, similar-sized economies, two countries with a global reach and global ambitions, who both possess significant armed forces, both nuclear powers, in the two nuclear powers in Europe, and we work together both within our neighbourhood but all over the world to protect our interests and advance our interests, which very, very often are shared interests. It's remarkable that despite the differences between Britain and France, which are very obvious and I think part of the strength of our relationship, we do often come down in a pretty similar judgment about what needs to be done around the world to protect our values and our interests. So today, for example, as we sit here, we have British Armed Forces operating alongside their French counterparts in the Sahel as part of the French operation there, which the Royal Air Force is supporting with 3 Chinook helicopters. We've worked together recently, for example, in the Baltic states, in Estonia, where British and French armed forces personnel have worked alongside each other, protecting NATO's eastern flank. We work together in the Middle East, and our navies work together, for example, all over the world. But that defence cooperation, which is underpinned by a treaty which you may have heard of, called the Lancaster House Accords, signed in November 2010. That defence cooperation is but one facet of this much broader and deeper relationship. We work together very closely on managing our shared border, for example, especially around Calais, where when you go through, for example, the bit difficult to do at the moment, but many fewer people are doing it. But when you next go through the Channel Tunnel, or you come on the Eurostar, as you pop out of the tunnel at Coquelles, you'll see either side of the railway track the security fencing there and the CCTV cameras and so on, protecting the port area and the entrance to the Channel Tunnel. That's all paid for by the United Kingdom. That's a very good example of our close cooperation on our shared border there. And of course, to those of you who've been through the either the Channel Tunnel by car or by on the Eurostar by train, you will have been through the juxtaposed controls, as we call them, where we have French border police at St Pancras, who are managing the border control there, and the UK border force up at the Gare du Nord or at the entrance to the Channel Tunnel. Again, a good practical example of Franco-British cooperation today. But we work together really across the board. Today we're working together researching, trying to find a vaccine for COVID-19. As it happens today, we have a British director of the world-renowned Institut Pasteur, Stuart Cole, who is a very eminent British researcher. Again, emblematic of the kind of cooperation between our countries, and we work together with people-to-people exchanges. Since I've been here as ambassador, we've launched a big program called Les Voisins, which really speaks to our relationship as neighbours, as the name implies. But we have so many Brits and so many French citizens making their lives in each other's countries. It's a relationship that obviously goes back, as we all know, over 1,000 years, that has had its well advertised ups and downs. I'm speaking to you from the embassy. In fact, the residence next door was purchased by my most distinguished predecessor, the Duke of Wellington, in the summer of 1814, when he was appointed ambassador here, and he bought it off Napoleon Bonaparte's sister, Pauline Borghese, and at the time Napoleon was in exile on Elba, and his sister was very anxious to join him. But in one of the quirks of history, it is alleged that the proceeds of the sale of this building were used by Napoleon to fund the 100 days and ultimately fetched up at Waterloo. But obviously since then, our history has been one of, for the most part, very close cooperation, particularly when the chips are down. And there's barely a week that goes by as the British ambassador in this country when I don't mark either a anniversary of the First or the Second World War, where that cooperation was brought into sharpest relief. Last week we were delighted to be able to welcome President Macron to London a week ago today. Almost a week ago at this moment, and President Macron was having tea with the Prince of Wales in Clarence House before laying a wreath at the statue of de Gaulle in Carlton Gardens and presenting London with the Légion d'honneur, a signal honour for the role that London played, and through its capital city, the United Kingdom, played in providing sanctuary for de Gaulle at the most dangerous moment in France's history. And as President Macron put it very eloquently in his speech, awarding London the Légion d'honneur, he said that at that moment, when all appeared lost, Britain provided France with its first weapon, a microphone, through the airwaves of the BBC. De Gaulle was able to launch his famous appel, calling on the French people to resist, and then follow it up several days later with a further speech, and then over the subsequent 4 years with many broadcasts to the French people. So it's an incredibly varied role. Every day is very, very different. Last week I was taking part in those ceremonies and joining the Prime Minister in the cabinet room for his meeting with President Macron. Yesterday I was doing my latest virtual tea party with representatives of British organisations here around France as part of our work as an embassy to support British citizens through this difficult period. Obviously, the work of this embassy and the work of the Foreign Office is in some ways similar, but in some ways different to all those decades ago. Obviously, the Foreign Office, like every British government department, and like society as a whole, is working hard to be more inclusive and more representative every day of the country that we are very proud to represent. And so the Foreign Office, like every public sector organisation, is obviously involved in and very mindful of the issues arising recently, including through the whole debate following the tragic death of George Floyd, and there's a very important and live debate about how we make the Foreign Office, for example, more inclusive for all the citizens that the Foreign Office represents around the world, and that's an important debate that is continuing. Beyond that, obviously, we're looking to a new chapter in the relationship between France and the United Kingdom, as well as between the United Kingdom and her European partners. Britain has now left the EU. We left the EU on the basis of the agreement that was negotiated at the end of last year, the so-called withdrawal agreement, which does three things essentially: sets out the principles that will govern the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Secondly, agrees the financial settlement upon Britain's departure. And thirdly, and importantly, protects the rights of British citizens living and working here in France, as well as in the other 27 member states across the EU. Right now, we're in the process, our colleagues in London are in the process of negotiating with their counterparts in Brussels the future relationship between Britain and the European Union. What we want is a free trade agreement based on the precedents that the EU has with other key trading partners, for example, Canada. We don't think we're looking for something exceptional. We think there are precedents there that would provide a model that would provide for an agreement. But obviously those conversations are underway at the moment. We hope that they will make it possible to reach an agreement, but obviously, as I say, those discussions are continuing. But that's on the EU front. On the relationship between France and Britain, I was noticing that a leading British political commentator was noting last week in his commentary on President Macron's visit that the Franco-British relations had rarely been stronger, and I think that's pretty fair. I think the relationship is in a very strong state. Both governments believe strongly in it. Both governments believe strongly that it's in both our national interests to reinforce it. We're two neighbouring countries that are facing very similar challenges in the world, whether it's projecting our influence around the world, whether it's making sure our economies can compete and generate jobs, obviously, and how we're having to face together a much more difficult situation than we were just 3 or 4 months ago. But it's interesting that we're adopting quite similar measures as governments to protect our economies and to protect jobs as we go through this very difficult crisis. That's probably enough from me by way of introduction. But let's have a chat, and let's please take any questions.
Ambassador, thank you very much.
I should warn you, I have about 15 to 20 minutes before I actually have to go to a meeting at the Elysee.
Totally understand. And a few questions to put you, but thank you very much for a very fascinating insight into your work and the work of your colleagues at the embassy in France. And it was really interesting to hear of all of the different aspects of that. Maybe if I can start off with one of the students' questions. As a way into the more detailed questions. So what would you consider the highlight of your time in Paris as an ambassador so far?
It's a very good question. I mean, this is a bit of a cop-out answer, but there have been so many. I'll tell you some of the highlights, and then the thing I'm proudest of. I mean, some of the highlights would be a few months after I arrived here, we had a very successful visit, I think, by Prince William and the Duchess of Cambridge in March 2017, when they made a visit to Paris and launched the Llewellyn program that I told you about a few moments ago. They were here for less than about 24 hours, and for the positive coverage and the goodwill their visit generated, they might as well have been here for a fortnight. It was absolutely brilliant, and really wowed Paris, and was a pretty amazing visit, with a visit to Les Invalides, which I can almost see through the trees at the end of the garden, the French equivalent of the Royal Hospital at Chelsea. Some rugby was played up on the Trocadero opposite the Eiffel Tower. They had a meeting with the president. We had an enormous gala dinner here at the residence for them. That was definitely a highlight. The Franco-British summit, now some time ago in January 2018 at Sandhurst. That was a highlight. What else? I would say last Thursday was definitely a highlight. You know, to be able to mark that very important anniversary that means so much to every French citizen in London, despite the constraints imposed by COVID, to mark it with real style and seriousness was an amazing highlight. I have 3 young kids, Franco-British children, 8, 6 and 4, and the two older ones are, like every French school child, are learning about the appel at school. So to be able to mark it in the way that we did in London with and in Paris with, I think the highlight of the whole thing was a fly past by the Red Arrows and their French equivalent, the Patrouille de France, over both cities, was quite something. And the UK also awarded the 4 surviving Compagnons de la Libération, the special order set up by General de Gaulle, with a British honour, with an MBE. That was also very, very special. The thing I'm most proud of is the work we've been doing. I've been helping to support on the Normandy memorial that's being built just above Gold Beach and will be finished next summer in time for D-Day, with the names inscribed on it of the 22,442 British and Allied, including French, service men and some women who died in the Battle of Normandy, the Normandy campaign, which liberated this country and ultimately Europe. And I'm very proud of having been able to support that campaign. It's one of the first things I raised with President Macron when he became the president of this country in May 2017, and he said then, we will do it, and together we've done it.
Thank you very much. It doesn't sound like you have very many boring moments in everyday life at the embassy. There's certainly a lot of highlights to reflect on there. One of the students would like to know what advice, Ambassador, you would give to budding diplomats, and how do you think their experience may differ to yours in a post-COVID world?
Hang on, unmute. I'll come to the post-COVID world bit in a moment. But my advice, such as, first of all, I'm a rather unusual diplomat in the sense that I'm not actually a diplomat, a formal diplomat. I am the only political appointment in our Foreign Office at the moment. But I don't really think of myself as a political appointment. I'm very proud to be a diplomat and to be performing a diplomatic role, and I have a rather unusual parcours, as they would say here, in that it's a sort of hybrid political diplomatic so-called career. I've worked many years ago for the Conservative Research Department, briefly for Margaret Thatcher. Then I was the political advisor to our last governor of Hong Kong, Chris Pathams. I spent 5 years there. I then did 2 tours in Sarajevo, one immediately after the war, and then one working for Paddy Ashdown a couple of years later. And then, as you alluded to earlier, working for David Cameron for 11 years, both as the leader of the opposition for 4.5 years and as Prime Minister for 6 and a bit years. And in all of those roles, there's been a diplomatic sort of component. And I think the role of diplomacy is as important as it's ever been, in the sense that it's more important than ever that nation talk unto nation, that governments talk unto governments, and that people understand each other. And it's not always successful, but I think it's a noble cause, and it's incredibly rewarding. So I think that will be true in 10 years, 30 years, 50 years, as it is today, even if things change. If if we'd been here 40 or 50 years ago, my predecessors would have been doing this job in a very different way, obviously, where there was far less contact, capital to capital, between Downing Street and the Elysee directly. But it just means that the role evolves. And for example, since I've been here, we've done far more, I think, to support British citizens in France than hitherto, because we've had to. Because of obviously the changing situation. Post-COVID, it's hard to know what the world is going to look like post-COVID. Obviously, I think some things obviously will change. I think we all appreciate the value of being able to do meetings like this very easily. I'm not sure this will go on forever. I think people like to be able to meet in real offices and talk to each other, and human beings are social animals. So I think it's hard to know how this is going to turn out in 5 or 10 years' time. I would just say that when I used to work as a young thing for Margaret Thatcher many years ago, she always used to say that Thatcher's iron rule of politics was that the unexpected always happened. And I found that a very good maxim over the years.
Thank you. It must have been fascinating to work for people and with people like Margaret Thatcher. It's very much someone of her time. Very interesting indeed. Thank you for that. A couple of Brexit questions. So I think the first one you've alluded to already, which is, how do you see the challenging times of Brexit affecting the UK-France relationship, and will it survive? And then, sort of connected to that, how can UK students be encouraged to study abroad in Europe after Brexit? So you've talked a little bit about how the relationship is strong despite Brexit. So I'm sure the students would like to hear a little bit more on that, and then what we can do to encourage students. You're on mute, sorry, Ambassador.
Trying to unmute, yes, there we go. Well, I mean, look, I hope you will have taken from my earlier remarks that, I mean, this not only is this relationship going to survive, it's going to thrive and prosper. I feel that incredibly strongly, and more importantly, my bosses feel that very strongly. The Prime Minister feels that extremely strongly. He is very committed to this relationship between France and Britain. His first trip overseas well, it was part of his first trip overseas as Prime Minister, was to Paris. He went to Berlin at the end of August last year, and then he came straight from his meeting with Chancellor Merkel to Paris to spend the night and to have lunch with President Macron the next day. That was at the end of August last year, and both leaders are very committed to building on this relationship, and they continued that conversation in Downing Street this time a week ago, because there are so many areas in which it makes sense for us to work together. I've already alluded to the defence and security realm, which is exceptionally important, but other areas too, not least post-COVID, in building a green recovery. We're both, as countries, very committed to that agenda. We were the first country to legislate to bring down our carbon emissions. We've both committed to a carbon neutral target as countries, and we both legislated to that effect. So that is just one area where there's an enormous amount of common ground, and whereas neighbours, again, it makes absolute sense for us to work together. So I'm really confident that with the rhythm of summits that we have, and we're due another one between France and the UK, and also with the strong relationship between our Prime Minister and President Macron, that there is every prospect of this relationship thriving into the future. And as part of that, people-to-people, known in my trade as people-to-people ties, are more important than ever, and that includes studying at each other's universities, spending time in each other's countries. I first got to know France, like many British kids, in a school exchange, and followed it up when I was at uni with spending part of my French language year, actually my year abroad learning French and German, as it happens. I spent my 5 months in France, here at this embassy in the consular section across the street, working in what was then our consular and visa section, which encouraged me in the pursuit of diplomacy, but also taught me a lot about this country. So I'd encourage all of, I mean, you're already doing it in a way, but I think it's fantastic, the work that ULIP does, and I think, you know, you are, it sounds a bit cheesy to say this, but I really think it's the case. You know, you are the leaders of this relationship in the future, people who know our respective countries well. I'm just going to make a plug here in my concluding 2 or 3 minutes for something called the Franco-British Young Leaders Programme, which we've launched again since I've been here. Under the auspices of the Franco-British Council, we select 30 to 40 young, entre guillemets, i.e. under 40. So President Macron would have qualified until very recently. He's actually on he was on the Franco-American one. But we have this program called the Franco-British Young Leaders Program, and it's now got, I think, 108 participants. We've just selected the 30 for this year, and it's a fantastic program. It's really taken off as a network. They each spend a week in each other's countries. It's going to be a bit difficult this year. They were due to be, this year's cohort were due to come to Paris, and, you know, I'm sure, as their predecessors did 2 years ago, they would have spent time at the Elysee and met President Macron and so on. Last year we had the same in the UK. But that's a great program, and I hope that some of you will think about applying for that maybe next year or in the years ahead. I'm going to have to go in like 1 minute, but I could take maybe one more question.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. That's
I put my tie on and my jacket. Apologies for being tieless, but it's a bit of an oven in here today.
Indeed, and what I might do is just thank you very much and ask ask Wendy if she'd like to say a couple of words, just in recognition of what you've contributed to us today. Thank you. Wendy.
Joe, thank you so much, Ambassador. It was really a delight to hear what you had to say. These are extraordinary times. We, I'm sure, will look back on this period as quite an outstandingly unique one, and I think it's great to hear your observations on it. So I'm sure the students have appreciated everything you've shared today. So on their behalf, let me thank you. Merci.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, Wendy.
Okay, au revoir.
Thank you to everyone who's.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all of you. I'm sorry I can't actually see you, but thank you all for joining and taking part. And I hope you found that was useful. And I should also thank my colleagues, Sarah Gill and Tom Barry, who they are here. I'm going to show them to you. Who had joined the discussion, but Tom is our expert on economic, but also on everything to do with EU exit and future relationship. And Sarah has very kindly helped set up this this meeting in the first place. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.